This video is going to take you through chapter 37, which covers communities and then ecosystems or ecology. Communities is all the populations in one area, so it's all the living things essentially in one area. So this is a spring in Africa. The fish are part of the community, the hippos are part of the community. The hippos are actually a very important part because they bring back a lot of nutrients to this pond, and then those nutrients end up feeding the phytoplankton, which helps to feed the fish eventually, and then the hippos go back out and they eat on land. They don't actually eat in the water, they just hang out in the water essentially. Interspecific interactions. This means that we're going to have interactions between different species. So maybe this, whatever this is, gopher looking thingy can interact with this guy, but more importantly, that goat's going to do things like eat those flowers. And you got to remember that flowers are species too, and so there's interactions between plants and animals. There's interactions between bacteria and the plants because the bacteria can do nitrogen fixation and the plants can't do that for themselves. So there's a bunch of different kinds of interactions that can happen. Essentially what you guys have next in the table is this table I have tried to recreate. What you guys are writing down are the pluses and minuses, and then an example. I'm not sure if I put an example in your notes or if you have to get something down. But competition is one type of interaction or symbiosis that can occur between species. All of these are symbiotic relationships between species. A lot of people confuse symbiotic relationship with mutualism. Symbiotic just means two species are interacting with each other. Mutualism means both species are going to benefit, but I'll come back to that in a second. So in competition, both species are competing for the same resources, and what that does is it lowers the number of resources that are available for both species, and so everybody loses in competition because they're competing for those same resources. So even though you would think a black bear could take on a squirrel no problem, and they probably could if they were as fast as a squirrel, they're actually both competing for the same fruits and nuts in a lot of cases, and so this reduces the population size of both of these two critters when they live in the same place. Next, mutualistic relationships mean that both species are going to win. So they gave you the example of hippos and the microbes in the hippo's stomach. So the microbes can break down the plant material that the hippo eats and then provide nutrients to the hippo, while the hippo provides a habitat for the microbes to actually live in. And so that's a decent example of a mutualistic relationship. In predation, the predator wins because it got a food source, but the prey item loses because, yeah, it's dead at this point. So crocodile is the predator, fish is the prey, the crocodile wins, the fish clearly loses. Herbivory is the same sort of thing, except the prey item is a plant material, so this is the hippo and the grass that it eats. The hippo wins, the grass loses. Parasites and pathogens are kind of a special type of predatory relationship where the parasite or the pathogen lives in or on the organism that it's actually eating, so the parasite or the pathogen wins, and then whoever it's living on is what loses. So salmonella is an enteric bacteria that can live in your gut and cause problems for you. It gets nutrients from you and you lose because now you have disease symptoms that kind of go along with that. Alright, so these are just some little gifts that kind of get you through some of your symbiotic reactions. So mutualistic, both the bee and the flower wins because the bee gets to collect some of the nectar from the flower and then the flower gets pollinated so it helps to reproduce. One of the examples that is not actually written out in your table, commensal relationships. Somebody wins, the barnacle, because it has a place to live, but it doesn't hurt or help the whale. That's another type of interaction that can happen. And then this is your parasitic example, another parasitic example. So you've got fleas and ear mites and things that can live on dogs, and the dog loses because it loses blood, or it gets painful symptoms in the ears, and so that's a parasitic relationship. So lions and hyenas are both competing for resources. They tend to keep population numbers in check, so that's competition. So everybody here loses. Another example of a mutualistic relationship is coral. And then there's algae that actually lives in the coral. That's what gives the coral its bright colors. The algae is photosynthetic, and so it's producing food for the coral, so the coral wins. But the algae also gets a place to live from the coral, and so the algae is also winning. So that's a mutualistic relationship. Predation, pretty clearly that gecko lost in this situation, and the spider is winning, and so it's a plus-minus relationship. This is the exact example that they gave you in the table earlier, so hippo wins, plant loses. Parasites aren't unique to animals. Plants can get parasites as well. So this is a bunch of aphids on, I don't know what kind of plant that is. It could be a bean, it could be zucchini, who knows. But what they do is they suck the sap out of the plant, and that makes the plant have to work harder to move materials through it. And in fact, when it's this heavy a load, it can actually kill the plant. And so the bug wins because it gets food, but the plant loses because it's losing some of its sap. All right. So ringworm is another example. How does that relationship essentially work? Well, the ringworm has a place to live, but it does give this, in this case, sheep disease symptoms. And so this is a parasitic relationship. So win, lose. How can people interact with doves? Well, a lot of people hunt doves, and so we've got a predatory relationship where we win because we get to eat the dove, and the dove loses because, yeah, it's dead now. All right, underneath the table, explain the concept of an ecological niche. This is everything that the animal needs in order to survive. It includes, in the bird's case, nest sites. It includes water sources, food sources. It's everything that they need, and every organism has its own niche. Habitat is part of the niche, but it's only part of the niche. So there's more that's involved in a niche than just the habitat. How does interspecific competition affect the carrying capacity of the environment? It's going to lower the carrying capacity because everybody's competing for the same things. So there are certain areas in Africa where elephants are coming up onto farmers' lands because farmers have expanded out into the elephant's territory. And then there's conflict between the elephant and the farmers where the farmers end up shooting, killing, poisoning, doing whatever they can to the elephant because the elephants will compete with the farmer for the farmer's own resources. They'll eat the farmer's yields, essentially. And so everybody loses in this situation, and that's how competition really works in the real world. There's lots of adaptations that organisms have to help reduce predation. So camouflage, if you can't see the frog, you can't eat the frog. And so that's one thing that you can do to protect yourself. Chemical defenses, anytime you have something that is brightly colored, that tends to mean they make some sort of toxin, poison, or venom. And so it's a warning signal to leave me alone, because if you try to eat me, I will kill you. This is a poison dart frog, and if you even so much as touch it, it will kill you. You don't even have to try to eat it. So that's a chemical defense. Mechanical defenses, if you were to go out and try to eat a porcupine, you would have problems with that because it has spines on it. And so that's an example of a mechanical defense. Plants also have these sorts of things. So this is a honey locust. They make like the worst thorns that have ever existed. Even their thorns have thorns. That's how thorny a honey locust is. That makes it really hard to eat, because if you went up here and you tried to collect some of these leaves to eat them, you would get poked by all of these things, so you would leave it alone. This plant is strychnose. It is a plant that produces strychnine, which is a poison. There are very few things that can eat it and survive because of the poisons that it makes, and so that's an example of a chemical defense that plants have to help them avoid herbivory. So parasites, just your definitions. These are things that are again going to be living in or on the food source that they're eating. This is a tick. It's an example of a parasite that can affect both people and a lot of the pets and farm animals that we have, and they can spread a lot of other diseases, pathogens, on top of the fact that the tick is a parasite itself. I've given you some other examples that go along right there. Pathogens are usually going to be microscopic things that intentionally cause disease in people as they get into you. So this can be any of the bacteria that we talked about in previous chapters as we were going through taxonomy. Like this looks like it's a MRSA infection for this person. Viruses are pathogens. Some fungal things can be pathogens as well. After that, you have explained what happened to the American chestnut. The only word that you have to get there is extinct. I've given you the rest of the story. So an invasive fungus or water mold, we kind of debate what that is, but it came over and it destroyed the trees. These trees lived along the east coast, and it provided a lot of food for the people that lived in that area. This just kind of shows you the size of these trees. And now you can't find any on the eastern seaboard anymore because this fungus wiped them out. There are still some populations, so they're not extinct yet in the wild. They're ecologically extinct because you don't actually have them in the forest participating in any of the interactions in that forest. But this is a species that we're still trying to save. After that, food chain, they usually cover that fairly well in high school. What I'll mention is, since I'm going to go fairly fast through a lot of these things coming up, you can pause this video at any point to get the definitions that you need. So producers are at the bottom of the food chain on land. This is going to be plants. Primary consumers are going to be your herbivores. So this would be like a cow, or right now there's locust swarms in Africa because, you know, 2020 wanted to get biblical on us and give us plagues and swarms of locusts. So they eat the crops that farmers are trying to grow. Secondary consumers eat the herbivores. Sometimes humans fit into this level when we eat our herbivores like a cow, but sometimes we're higher up in the food chain. It just kind of depends on what we're eating. Tertiary consumers eat secondary, and quaternary consumers eat tertiary, and things don't usually go above the quaternary level because there's not a lot of energy available if you try to go above the quaternary level. All right, detritus or detritus, I don't really care which way you want to say that. It's dead stuff. So this could be like the dead elk that's laying here. It could be leaf litter. It's just dead stuff that usually scavengers or decomposers are going to try to eat. So scavengers are things like vultures or crows or ravens, where they're going to eat a lot of the, especially meat material on things like dead animals like this elk right here, versus decomposers are going to go for things that are a little bit more decayed and like rotting vegetation as well is going to be what the decomposers try to do. Decomposers are usually going to be your bacteria and your fungi. Food web is a more realistic way to look at a food chain because, again, you don't belong on one level on a food chain like the food chain makes you think. Instead, you can go in different places depending on what you're eating at that time. Like if you had cereal for breakfast, well, cereal it's vegetable based. It's usually something like wheat or rice that makes a cereal. That makes you a primary consumer when you eat something like that. Unless you drink the milk, that puts you a level up because you're eating something that came from a primary consumer. And so even with that one thing, you belong on different levels on a food web. So the food web just kind of shows you how different things interact with each other, and it's a more realistic way to look at who's eating what, essentially. One of the things biologists like to do as we evaluate the health of the community is figure out how diverse that community is, and there's two factors that come into that. Species richness tells you how many different species are in an area, and the relative abundance tells you how many of each species are in an area. So I'm going to show you two pictures here. This is the first one. If you look at this, there are 4 different species of tree, but the relative abundance of this tree is considerably higher than any of the other species that are in there. So even though it has 4 species, the diversity is lower because most of the trees in this forest are of this type right here. Compare that to this picture, we still have 4 different species of tree, but now we don't have one that is more abundant than the others. And so this forest lot would have an increased diversity because the relative abundance is more evenly dispersed between the species. You guys already have everything that you need with problems associated with low diversity. This increases disease spread through an area. So this is a little patch of oak wilt. Since most of the trees that are around our area are oak trees, oak wilt can spread through the population that much faster and then wipe out all the trees because we don't have that much diversity in our area. The other thing that kind of goes along with this diversity stuff, there's a reason that cities prefer for people to have lawns that look like this. It's a monoculture. It's all one thing, which means it's not providing habitat for a whole bunch of different species. So a bunch of cockroaches or mice or snakes can't live in this because there's just not that much habitat for them. Versus if somebody's got a lawn that's overgrown like this, well, now we've got more species richness, and usually we get a more diverse abundance of species in there as well. That means we're providing more habitat for more things, and so there's more likely to be pests like, again, cockroaches, snakes, mice, rats. And so cities preferably want to have people with this kind of lawn because it decreases that pest control sort of situation that we've got going on. That's also just a note for you. If your lawn tends to look like this and you also tend to get bugs in your house, that's why. You're providing them with more habitat. So keeping your lawn freshly mown tends to decrease the number of pests that you have in your area. All right. Keystone species, I've already given what you need for most of that there. I just wanted you guys to write down an example. So for your example of a keystone species, this is the one that actually defined a keystone species. This sea star, its genus is Pisaster. Pisaster eats things like clams and mussels. They thought that removing the Pisaster would help increase the number of clams and mussels that were in an area, but what ended up happening was sea urchins overgrew and they wiped out everything else. What was happening was Pisaster was keeping the sea urchins in check, and when we lost Pisaster, the sea urchins started to just overgrow and sort of bloom, and then they wiped out all the kelp in the area. And so this one sea star is really important because it does help to keep everything else in check, and it keeps the abundance of everything at a level where everybody is in a symbiotic, happy little relationship. Disturbance. So this is something that disrupts the system. I'm giving you several different examples there, but if you've paid any attention to the news, you know that fire is a big one that's affecting a whole bunch of different areas. Heck, Australia nearly burned down this past, well, it was their summer, but our winter time. California's been having increased fires. Texas is weird because we've actually had an increase in rain for the last couple of years, and so that decreases our fire season. But fires completely disrupt a system because they destroy that primary level, that, you know, the producer level of the food chain, and so it makes it harder for anything else to live there. After a disturbance, a community can start to try to regenerate itself, and when it does that, it's called ecological succession, and there's two ways that ecological succession can happen. First, there's new land that gets created through volcanism or plate tectonics, and when new land gets exposed to the surface, we start out with very, very small things like bacteria and fungi that start to colonize that new land, and then they start to break up the rock, and that releases nutrients. Once the nutrients are available, then you start to get things like really small plants like moss that start to grow. And then they continue to break up the rock and produce more nutrients, and so then you can get larger plants, and then it just continues to bloom from there. So this is a volcanic field that's relatively new, but you can already see there's life that's starting to occur on that, so that's primary succession. Secondary succession is that disturbance thing. So a fire comes through, and then after the fire, things get replaced. So the soil was already in place during secondary succession. We just had to go from that point. So primary succession, we had to make the soil, but secondary, the soil was there and we could just grow things in that soil from there. All right, invasive species are species that were introduced to an area and then they started to overgrow because there were no competitors and there were no predators that could help control those numbers. One of the ones that we have a problem with here in Texas is feral hogs. Feral hogs can be very aggressive, so if you, I won't say sneak up on them, they have really poor eyesight, and so it's easy to sneak up on them. But if you surprise them, they will charge you, and they have, especially the males, they have these really large tusks, and they can gore you and kill you. Also, I don't know if you've ever met a person who's hit one of these with their car, but if you hit a full-grown hog, they will total your car, especially if you are going at highway speeds. They dig up land, they reduce plant growth, they compete with things like cows and horses, and so it reduces the carrying capacity of the land, so they're a good example of an invasive species. Fire ants are another one. They got introduced, we think, into a port in Alabama, and then they have spread from there. This is an old map. They have moved farther north than this. They have outcompeted with other ants, and they are one of the reasons that you don't see horny toads in our area anymore. Horny toads like to eat those big red ants, but not fire ants. Fire ants will actually swarm a horny toad and then kill them, and so this is one of the reasons why you don't find them anymore. Different species from a different continent. So rabbits are not naturally found in Australia. They were introduced by a person who wanted rabbit meat. And then they did what rabbits do. They made lots of baby rabbits, and they kept trying to build fences to control the rabbit spread, but it didn't work. And so they have basically made it everywhere, all over the place. All of these little things are them trying to show them building fences to stop the rabbits from moving, and not a single one of them worked. You can find them everywhere. Another example from our area, this is a brown-headed cowbird. There's two main problems with them. One, they're an invasive species. They outcompete some other things. But two, they are also what's known as a nest parasite. The mom is too lazy to make her own nest, so instead she finds another bird's nest when the parents have left. She kicks those eggs out of the nest and then lays her eggs in that nest, and then when the other mother comes back, she raises the brown-headed cowbird baby. Also, really rudely, when a brown-headed cowbird baby hatches, it hatches before the other birds were going to hatch, and then it kicks the other eggs out of the nest so that they don't even survive. And so they've really hurt a couple of different species of songbirds in our area. How can they be controlled? I already gave you everything you need for that. So we poison things. We try to bring back biological controls. So in the case of the rabbits in Australia, they introduced a virus called the myxoma virus that only kills rabbits. The problem is the virus became less virulent, and so even that didn't work with the rabbit population. Next up, ecosystem. This is what starts to bring in those abiotic factors like soil and water and things that are going to be important for living things. energy flows. Usually in terrestrial systems, it's going to be coming from sunlight. Photosynthesizers use that sunlight to make chemical energy and the way of making organic molecules like glucose. And then that's the basis for the whole food chain or food web that we talked about. Energy does not cycle back. It just flows through the system from sun to producers and then through the food chain on up. Chemical cycling is different. This does cycle through a system. We only have a set number of the different atoms within the planet Earth, and so we have to keep sending those things through the system over and over again. Things like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, those are very important chemicals that everything needs to make its organic molecules, but again, there's limited numbers of those, and so they have to keep going up the food chain, down through the decomposers who release it again so it can go back up through the food chain. Biomass is all the living stuff in an area, like it's the weight of all of that stuff. Primary production is how fast the producers can actually make those organic molecules. That's dependent on the amount of sunlight that's coming in and how efficient those primary producers actually are. Which ecosystems have the highest primary production? So in the ocean, it's coral reefs, and then estuaries are also fairly high. Notice the open ocean has very poor primary production. On land, it's the forests. It's the tropical rainforests and then the temperate deciduous forests have the highest primary production, which makes sense. That's where you get more plants than any place else. Oh yeah, on that same one, lowest primary production. Open ocean is essentially a desert. Tundra and then desert is going to go in here. They really didn't put desert. Oh, no, they did. I put it lower. Sorry. So desert and tundra, those are the ones that have the lowest primary production on land. How energy supply limits the length of food chain. What this essentially boils down to is each level of a food chain is only about 10% efficient. So let's say that there were 100 calories available. That means you only get 10 calories out of those 100 calories that are available to you. So what this is trying to show you is this is how much sunlight comes into a specific place on the planet. Yet, plants are only about 10% efficient. So out of that million calories that the sun is spewing out at those plants, they only can harness about 10,000 calories of that. Then as you go up to the next food chain, those primary consumers, like the grasshopper or the cow, they're not very efficient at getting the energy out of the food that they eat, so they're only getting 1,000 calories available to them to build their own biomass. And then as you go up, you lose another 90%, so there's only 100 calories available for the secondary consumers, and then we lose another 10% for those tertiary consumers. So that's why you can't have things that are higher up than quaternary level. There's just not enough energy available once you get to those levels. Okay. So the book that I made these notes out of then starts talking about why meat should be considered a luxury, and what it comes back to is where you belong on a food chain. If humans are relying on plant material to provide them with the calories that they need during the course of a day, there's more energy available to feed us, so we could use less farmland to feed more people. But when we are higher up on the food chain, now we're not growing our corn to feed us, we're growing the corn to feed the things that we eat, and they're not very efficient, and so that means there's less energy available. We have to grow plants on more land to feed cows that take up land that we can't grow stuff on, so that we get fewer calories that are available to us. So one of the things that you can try to do to lower your carbon footprint is at least one day a week, maybe more if you can manage it, do like meatless Mondays where you don't eat any meat on that day and you get all of your nutrients, including your protein, from plants. Nuts and beans are fantastic sources of protein, and you actually get more energy available to you from that because you're lower in the food web when you eat plant material. Just coming back to that, feedlots are how we grow our meat at this point. They are not sustainable. If you've ever driven past a feedlot, they stink because of the amount of waste that's being produced. That waste has to be processed, which there's getting to be some more efficient ways to do that, but this is still just not sustainable because think about all the land where we're having to grow stuff so that we can feed these, so that we can eat these. Disease is also more likely to spread when you grow things in this close proximity, and so that's another issue where you're starting to see contamination that's in the food that's being served to people. The other thing that kind of goes along with this is I kind of have this personal belief where if you haven't killed something and eaten what you've killed, I don't think you should get to eat meat. If you can't kill it for yourself, why do you get to eat it, essentially? And so this is some people that are butchering a cow. If you've never done it, it makes you really appreciate the meat that you're eating more when you've done something like killed it for yourself, skinned it, and then gotten the meat out of that. All right. Next up, you have your biogeochemical cycles. So these are the chemicals like carbon and phosphorus that have to cycle through the system. There's going to be an abiotic reservoir where that chemical is when it's not inside of a living organism. So for example, carbon, its abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But phosphorus's abiotic reservoir is in rocks, and that's where you can find that when it's not inside living things. So everything kind of has its own abiotic reservoir. After that, I gave you different pictures of some of the important cycles. So this is the carbon cycle. And again, the abiotic reservoir is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants in photosynthesis take that carbon dioxide and then they turn it into organic molecules like carbohydrates. Primary consumers eat those. Higher level consumers eat those. They carry out cellular respiration, which, remember, that's where you take your organic molecules like glucose and you burn it and you release carbon dioxide back. Decomposition also plays a role in releasing carbon dioxide back, and burning of fossil fuels increases the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, plants can uptake that carbon dioxide that we put in by burning fossil fuels. The problem is we have deforested at such a rate that there aren't enough plants to remove all the carbon dioxide that we've pumped into the atmosphere. And so carbon dioxide levels have been increasing since the Industrial Revolution, and that's a whole greenhouse gas thing that we're going to talk about in a later chapter. This is just a graph from an observatory in Hawaii that shows you that increase in carbon dioxide levels that I was just talking about. And you can see very plainly carbon dioxide levels have increased. What's interesting is you can even see the Earth breathe during the course of a year. Carbon dioxide levels increase during the winter time because plants have lost their leaves and they're not photosynthesizing. And then they decrease as plants get more active during the summertime. And so you can see summer and winter very clearly on there, but the trend is carbon dioxide levels are increasing. Next up, phosphorus cycle. The abiotic reservoir for that is in the earth itself, like it's in the soil and it's in the rocks. As rocks weather, they release phosphorus and it leaches into the water. We drink the water. Plants also uptake that water, and so they put the phosphorus into their organic molecules, especially their proteins and their nucleic acids. As the food chain eats those things, it gets in there, and then decomposers can release some of that stuff back. One of the problems with phosphorus is we used to put phosphorus into our detergents, both our laundry detergent and our dish detergent, and so we artificially increased the amount of phosphates in certain areas, and so we're responsible for some problems that came along from that. Nitrogen cycle is special. So the abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere, but the nitrogen in the atmosphere is unusable by plants and animals. They can't use N2 for any of its purposes. So what happens is bacteria are capable of what's known as nitrogen fixation. They convert that nitrogen gas into forms that are more usable. Eventually it's going to get down to ammonium and then nitrates, and plants can use both of those. It can use nitrates better than ammonium, but it can use both of those. And when plants take those up, they can incorporate it into their organic molecules, and then we go through the food chain and decomposition still happens. So nitrogen fixation, it's what converts that nitrogen gas into a form that a plant can use. Nitrate is the most easily absorbed form of nitrogen that plants can use. Eutrophication is the next thing that you guys have. So I mentioned phosphorus earlier. Nitrogen is another example of something that carries out eutrophication, but if you add too much of any nitrogen or phosphorus, what happens is you get this overgrowth of either cyanobacteria or algae, or in some cases plants. It depends on where it got released. And that sounds like it's a great thing, except once the bloom happens, eventually they run out of those nutrients and then they die. When they die, especially in water, they create this layer that is oxygen poor, and that kills other things that are in the water that they're living in. And so that's kind of what's important there. I don't know if I really want to talk about that one, so I'm going to skip it. Why is it important to maintain the environment is the next thing that you guys have. Would you want to live here is essentially the moral of the story. I personally would not want to live there because I don't want the smell. I don't want the carrion and the disease that can come along with that. And so it's important to maintain the environment because you live in the environment and you would like your environment to be a more peaceful place for you. The other examples that I gave you in the notes is it can provide you with nice clean drinking water. While we do filter water, it's because we use an excess of what the earth can actually filter for us. Plants produce oxygen for us, they provide the food for us, and so if the ecosystem is intact, we get a whole bunch of what we call ecosystem services from the materials that are in there. Now, what this is going to show you, this is essentially going to be analogous to a mangrove forest. Now, mangroves tend to live along coastlines. If really strong waves come up, mangroves do a really good job of depleting the energy of those waves. So notice on this side, you can't even hardly see those. So when there's tsunamis, these help to mitigate the effects of those tsunamis. And so when Hurricane Katrina hit in Louisiana, because we had deforested a lot of those swamplands, they had massive flooding. If we hadn't removed all the mangroves, it wouldn't have flooded as badly as it did. And so that's another thing that the environment can provide for us. Sustainability. This means that you are harvesting resources in such a way that you're not destroying the resource so that you can continue to use it for a long period of time. When we first came to America, we essentially clear-cut like every forest that we ran across so that we could build more houses and have more fires and do more things. And the problem is we ran out of forest. So then they started, sometime around the 1950s and 60s, they started to realize that what they were doing was problematic. And so they, instead of clear-cutting a forest, they would do more selective harvesting. And so they would only harvest so many logs out of a forest and then move to the next area. And that way there's still habitat for the things that lived there. And more importantly, in 10 years, there's still some wood that we can harvest from that area. And so it's a more sustainable way to harvest that stuff. Okay, what you guys are going to do for the assignment for this chapter is do a Kahoot challenge that I have posted for you. I'm going to post this link into Schoology as well so you can click it and access it from there. But you need to go in and complete this quiz. I'm going to say by Wednesday at what would have been the close of class. So let's see, that's Wednesday, March 25th, and our class usually ended at 11. And so you have until March 25th at 11 a.m. to complete this Kahoot challenge.